Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to discuss The Radiance of the King by Camara, which is an incredible novel. It was published in the 1950s and is set in Guinea, in West Africa, in what was Camara's homeland. He was born there and then later on educated and living as a young adult in France. But the book is just absolutely fascinating. It draws from so many different traditions. It draws from the concept of the quest. It draws from ideas around surrealism. It draws on the ideas of sort of the journey into Africa tradition that had become more prominent in the latter 19th century. So it does all of these things, but more than anything, it is restoring not only the radiance of the titular king, but it's restoring a real radiance to Africa, to the people there, to Africans, to the villages, to the traditions, to the land, to the beauty. And it really is a book that accomplishes all of that. And it was a real joy to read. It's a strange and interesting book that draws the reader in, and gradually through our main character, our narrator Clarence, through his perceptions of what he sees and the ways that his perceptions are challenged, the realizations that he has, and sort of the blinds that are pulled away from his eyes, those same blinds are pulled away from a reader's eyes, particularly a reader who's viewing Africa from a sort of a colonialist perspective. So it's a really, really interesting book. We follow Clarence as he is lost all of his money gambling. He didn't have much to start with in a coastal town, and he misses an audience with the king. Assuming he can just get a job with the king because he's white. And he even says that at the very beginning. He goes, "I came here in order to speak to the king," he said. "So you want to speak to the king?" said the black man, looking Clarence up and down for a second time. "That is what I came for." "But it's unheard of," said the black man. "It's absolutely unheard of. Young man, do you think the king receives just anybody?" "I am not just anybody," replied Clarence. "I am a white man." "A white man?" said the black man. He made as if to spit, but stopped himself just in time. "Am I not a white man?" cried Clarence. "The white men do not come here on the esplanade," retorted the black man, using the same abrupt tone of voice as he had used before. No, this esplanade would not be the place for white men to put in an appearance," Clarence thought bitterly. "They wouldn't let themselves be shoved around by all these black men. They'd be more likely sitting in their villas where it was cool, or else playing cards and sipping iced drinks on the veranda of the hotel." And that's sort of the Clarence we start with. He has this very deep sense of privilege, of arrogance around what he really thinks that the king ought to be coming to view him, not he having to go seek an audience with the king. After all, he's from Europe. And then gradually his sense of place unravels. And as it unravels, it's a very disorienting sequence of events. He has no money, so he's basically sued for his clothing by the innkeeper. And his experiences in the courtroom feel very similar to those of Joseph K. and Franz Kafka's The Trial, and even the Before the Law parable that's in there. But there's this deep sense of irony and humor that's much more obvious than the very dark humor existing within Kafka's novels. And so Clarence joins up with a beggar and two young boys and just begins a long walk through the forests to a town in the south, because they expect that since the king has been in this region, he's going to head south at some point. And that journey is really interesting. As I said, there are ways in which Radiance of the King is sort of drawing on the novels of Joseph Conrad and the exploration and adventure stories of others, works like H. Rider Haggard, She, or King Solomon's Mines. As he's traveling, the forest is a dangerous place. It is a place that is hard. It pushes humans to their very limits. But as it's going on, there are also just these incredibly beautiful descriptions of the nature. And they remind me a little bit of what Cormac McCarthy would do in some of his works, in both Blood Meridian and All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing, where as much as the narrative is harsh to humans, there's this appreciation for the beauty of nature. The second part of the novel has Clarence in a small village where he seems to be befuddled around what's actually going on. There's a clue to what's going on, because Clarence has been unable to sort of tell the different Africans apart. He's on that journey with the beggar and the two young boys. The two boys, he couldn't really tell them apart from the way they looked. And then their names are even Nawaga and Nagoa, and he keeps just kind of calling them by interchanging names. And again, continuing to view those around him with just this real contempt. But he's slowly realizing that he needs to depend on them. That if you're in Kafka's trials, if you're deep in Joseph Conrad's forest, and truly all of these are, of course, representations of African culture, then you need help. You need other people around you, as in any community. And so he gradually starts to appreciate to a certain degree the people around him, and to realize that many of the assumptions he's been making are flawed. But there's an interesting moment where the woman who is staying with him in the village and sort of gets the water and cooks and like does this awkward shower. I'm here, she said. I was just putting my jar down. Her pretty little mug appeared, framed in the oval of the porthole. Yes, it was Achebe, all right. It was she, beyond all shadow of a doubt. Of course, it was not always easy for Clarence to tell one black face from another, but this was definitely, incontestably, Achebe's face, which was framed in the oval of the porthole window. Two very large eyes, perhaps no larger than anyone else's, but appearing even larger than they really were because of the violent contrast between the white of the eye and the ebony blackness of its setting. A pretty little nose with a rather roguish tilt, and then a pair of well-defined, almost too well-defined lips. Clarence suddenly thought of Achebe's body. He could only see her face, but in his imagination... and it goes on. And Clarence goes on. And gradually we realize these many, many aspects of Clarence's weaknesses, of his weakness as a human, as a person, of the way that he just sort of takes from everybody in the village. And there are people who allow that to happen and are sort of subtly using him for their own purposes, but there are others who have a deep resentment, and I think it's justifiable for Clarence. And, you know, this sense of he takes without ever giving back. But the selflessness of some of those characters and the ways in which they sort of rally around him when he has a deep moment of doubt at the end, you know, faltering right there at the end of this quest to find the king, they reveal a real love and affection that they can have, even though Clarence hasn't necessarily merited it. And there are ways in which this whole wait for the king, and it reminded me a little bit of Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, and that question around like silence and waiting and waiting and waiting, and all we receive is silence. But there's a current of, I think, hope that runs through the Radiance of the King. And the ending is incredibly, incredibly beautiful, as Clarence gradually is sort of, he's stripping away his preconceived notions around what's happening, what he deserves, what he's earned, and he's realizing the merits others have, the ways in which others can help him and have been communicating with him. He has some really incredible experiences where his sort of perception is shifting, and he seems to almost walk through a hut at one point. He seems to have a vision of the king traveling down through the south and sort of recounting his own experiences on that journey and thinking about them from the perspective of a king and the full entourage that's traveling. He begins to appreciate the intricate dances that are going on, and that they're not just this, you know, mass of people stamping and throwing up dust. But ultimately, the way in which the king is willing to look past those same, you know, unearned merits for Clarence is I think very hopeful and beautiful. So I enjoyed this book thoroughly. I really would recommend it to anybody, particularly readers who enjoy surrealism. I was thinking of books by Kafka and Murakami throughout my reading of The Radiance of the King. I really, really enjoyed this. Now, I do want to mention that the book was published in the 1950s under Laye's name, and it is the only novel he wrote. His other works were all autobiographical, and it's the only novel that's not autobiographical from his pen. And in more recent years, there's been controversy around how much editing did he receive, because he was writing in his 20s there in Paris. And it does seem that there are other people who were contributing. But I think beyond who wrote the book, it is an amazing book. The way that it goes and tries to shift the perspective and really like consciously shift perspective on all of those previous novels we've read from sort of a very European perspective, I think is highly accomplished. And I think I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Whoever wrote it, it's beautiful and it's amazing. And I just hope, you know, others will give it a shot. I had mentioned, of course, the works of Kafka feel very relevant. Combinations of the trial and that perpetual quest to get to the castle felt like they were combined into this book. Last year, I had read both Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World, and Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. There are some Murakami-esque male gaze scenes, but they really do seem to be much more of a parody, particularly with the final ending of Clarence and the King. I think there's a real way to call into question the ways in which we might think of Clarence as sort of leering at all of the women there in the African villages. I would be remiss if I was not noting that along with the great Cyprian Equenses, wonderful people of the city, we also have Things Fall Apart from Chinua Achebe, which is one of the great African novels. I had mentioned, of course, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad feels very relevant. The great Toni Morrison was a firm believer in the novel and a reader of the novel, and in her introduction she writes about the different other African writers she had cued on as an adult and sort of drawn from, and I think works like Song of Solomon show that type of influence. The middle part of the book where Clarence is in the village and gradually more and more is revealed, and in particular a character reminded me of Potiphar from the Joseph in Egypt portion of the stories of Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann. The sections in the forest, and even the sections where Clarence just feels so out of place, justifiably, reminded me, of course, of the great Zama by Antonio di Benedetto, set in rural Argentina and Paraguay. The ways in which the truth is revealed to Clarence, and thus also for the readers, although readers are catching on before Clarence is, reminded me of the ways that David Diop used our sense of narrative to shift our perspective in very jarring and sudden ways in At Night All Blood is Black. And as I was thinking of the various quest forms that the Radiance of the King shows, I was also reminded of works like The Quest for the Holy Grail or Parzival. So let me know if you've read this. Let me know if you've read any of, I think it's The Dark Child is Laye's early autobiographical work, or if there are other African writers that you really are interested in. So again, I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.